Good afternoon, and welcome to GRC301. I'm Chad Lawrence. I'm with AWS Professional Services. Go ahead and check your headsets, make sure you've got the blue ones and that you can hear everything. If you have any technical problems, raise your hand and someone will come around and help you. I'm Chad Lawrence. I'm a practice manager with AWS, working in professional services directly with customers, helping them enable their security and compliance. This is Krista Gorman. She's with the Control Tower team as a lead in one of the services that we're going to be focusing on today. And we just want to start out by saying we know as compliance and audit people that you're under a lot of pressure to validate against complex, ever-changing landscape of requirements. We also understand that cloud is another set of complexity for you to deal with in an already hard job. And we want to tell you, we will show you a way not only to leverage the power of the cloud to meet your compliance requirements, but to help drive business value. And so with that, let's go ahead and get started. So first, we're going to talk about compliance maturity. I'm going to give you a couple benchmarks to measure you against as you look at where you are in your compliance maturity. We're going to then introduce Control Tower and some of our other AWS services and how they change the game for compliance. And last of all, we're going to give you some real practical actions that you can take to begin to move your program forward immediately. So let's start with compliance maturity. To begin our compliance maturity, though, we have to talk about what is kind of the status quo. I walk into a lot of customers and my first question is often, show me where your compliance program is and what kind of automation you've put in. And I tend to get the same answer. The status quo tends to start out with this giant spreadsheet, right? It's this complex control spreadsheet, defines all your controls against all the things requirements you have to meet, how you're going to measure it, who's going to do it. It's kind of the master document, right? And then this is usually the first place we see a little bit of automation. There's some kind of email-driven timing. Maybe you've integrated it with a help desk system or some other ticketing system. And it kind of tells people when to start, where to put their data, and when they have to complete it. And then last of all, there's actually the workers, right? The heavy lifting, the manual attestation that people have to do. And so these are kind of the three components we see in the audit programs. When we see this, yeah, there's some credit there. Right? You've done some automation, right? I think some of the early phases was figuring out, hey, let's define our controls, measure once and apply it across many programs with that tracking. There was the implementing the email nags, right? And making sure everybody's on timing and alerting when those are. But it's really just the beginning phases of what you can do with automation and compliance. So my first question to you is, what is your biggest challenge when it comes to regulatory compliance in the cloud? So if you have a chance to pull out your phone, we're actually going to do a live polling question here. I encourage you guys to scan that. And we really want to gauge this presentation to where you're at. So help us understand, what is your challenge? Is it about meeting specific requirements? Is it more about limited budget and tools? Or are you struggling with internal expertise and turnover? Or last might be a confusion on how to apply those standards to the cloud. Pick the one that's most relevant. These may all feel relevant or none of them may feel relevant, but pick the one that's the most relevant to you. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be throwing up these QR codes, so expect that. As an auditor, I understand when I throw out stats, you're going to want to audit me and make sure I'm telling you the truth. So you can scan codes throughout the presentation to validate some of my stats. But let's go ahead and move to the polling and see where our answers came up. Confusion on how to define and apply regulatory requirements within AWS. Significantly the highest one, and then we have some balance here between tools and internal expertise. So I appreciate that. Thank you. We'll go ahead and go back to the slides now. So let's break this down a little bit with the thought of that, we're all struggling with some of this cost. So the first thing we want to do is we want to break down those sections. We're going to start with that spreadsheet. The question you need to be asking with this spreadsheet is, how accurate is this really for my compliance program? How consistent in it? Am I introducing errors? And I'm going to give you some external resources that says, yeah, we're introducing errors, but also help us understand where we're introducing errors, because that is an opportunity for some of your automation. 27% of failed controls are due to competency in the staff, specifically in the compliance staff. So that's some of that understanding the regulations and how to apply them. That's knowing how to define the measurement so that the people in the field can measure. 33% is due to control failures, often due to measurement, right? This is where you're pushing it out to those attesters. Often your quality of your audit is based on the quality of that person in the field, right? And when you have turnover, you lose some of that knowledge. And this comes from a Deloitte 2019 survey. So first of all, we have errors in our current status quo. The next thing is how much money per audit. Every time you fire off that email chain process, how much money is that costing your business? Now, this may not surprise you if you're in finance, but it's a huge number. 4 to 10% of your revenue goes to compliance in the financial services industry. Now, some of you may be saying, oh, thank goodness I'm not in financial services. I'm in something simple like manufacturing. Interesting enough, also from the National Association of Manufacturers, is their measurement that between $10,000 and $30,000 per employee per year for compliance. With the higher end of that being for the smaller the manufacturer, the greater the burden per employee. So it doesn't really matter if you're finance or you're manufacturing. If you have lots of compliance requirements or few, it is a cost to your business that you have to consider every time you fire off that audit process. Last of all, I want to talk about how much time. This is how much time those people in the field actually spend trying to measure against those spreadsheet controls that you've defined. 40% of our cost is actually pushed out on the business. Those are your IT and business experts that are doing that control gathering for you. So we can see we definitely have an equation here that is not adding up very well for us from the cost and impact to our business as far as how compliance is impacting the businesses we're working in. So the question is, what does the future look like? And to talk about the future, we kind of have to wrap our minds around a couple concepts, right, for compliance. First of all is the concept of data gravity. The concept of data gravity is that where your data goes, your apps are going to follow. This is because a need for increased throughput and lower latency. So as compliance, you can look into the future and say, hey, where that data is going, those apps and those things that I'm auditing are going to follow it. In a 2002 survey, they said 60% of all corporate data is already in the cloud. So we have this data gravity pulling us towards the cloud, but there's a multiplier effect in play here as well, and that is emerging technologies. IoT, natural language processing, all the things that are happening right now are drawing us towards cloud technologies and are dependent on cloud for scale and functionality. What that means is not only do we have data moving there, but you have new technologies and new things you're going to have to audit against. As an auditor, my favorite is where the data is, so I'm going to pick on data warehousing as the emerging technology. 90% almost of companies now in the near future are going to use data warehousing. So that means your company is probably already putting that data that you're concerned about as an audit or concerned about from compliance into the cloud. So it's pretty clear from just these two basic facts that the future of compliance is in the cloud. So now we have this collision. We have our current state, and we know our future state is moving to the cloud. But basically, we're getting more complex, more dynamic, more distributed, more regulated, and more costly. And this is probably not a surprise to any of you in the audience, right? But what we're trying to drive here is getting to those business objectives that we can deliver through compliance. I think Eric Klein said it the best. We have a legal regulatory framework built on the basis of paper, mail, and words versus a new world order that is digital, continuous, and 24/7, and built on bits and bytes. Somehow, we need to square these two worlds. So what does that look like? Well, first of all, we have to go back into that process and break it down one more step. We're going to go back to that spreadsheet. Most of you have already added this to your programs where you found your controls and you've mapped them across. If you haven't, if you're new to compliance, don't start up from scratch. A lot of people have already put some really great frameworks out there you can grab. I put a link to one of them. But let's blow that up for a minute and take a look. What that is that control is going to be mapped. So you're taking your company's control, you're mapping it to all the standards you're using so that you can leverage that measurement across standards. And then you're also giving the details of how that control is tested, as well as who's going to test the controls. So how do we break this out? How do we change this dynamic where we're living out of a spreadsheet from compliance and move it into automation? And so the first thing we're going to talk about is Control Tower. AWS Control Tower, an automated dashboard that continuously updates, that does this control tracking for you, but it also defines your controls technically versus having a human trying to audit against it. And you can deploy those controls for measurement in a point and click way. That's the first key to really accelerating some of your audit maturity. And what we're looking for is we're looking to eliminate those errors, right? So if you're doing defined technical measurement instead of people, you're now driving down the error. You're also driving down your staff requirements. Now you don't have to have that genius one guy or one gal out there in the business that knows how to measure for your program and give you accurate results. One of the things we do as auditors is the first time we run into cost and time complexities, what do? We reduce scope. So if you could eliminate some of these errors and time complexities, the first question is, can I start increasing scope? And that's going to be your first measurement to tell you, hey, I'm starting to move that automation maturity needle. I'm beginning to be able to increase my audit scopes instead of consistently decrease them. And I'm sure you've all been in that position where you've had to decrease a scope more than you would want to as an auditor or as a compliance officer. So the next place we're gonna go after the heavy lifting right away. We're gonna jump straight to the attestation. How do we deal with that, right? We know that that has a huge impact on the business. We're gonna talk about how you leverage AWS Audit Manager to do that data collection and evidence collection. So that immediately has the impact of decreasing your cost to audit, right? Now you're not pushing that out on the business, you're not pushing that on a specialist, you're able to automate that. What comes with that, right? We're trying to get some business trade-offs, right? We're selling this automation program to a board, to a CIO, to a CTO, to somebody that we're trying to justify why we need this money, why we need this effort for automation. And the answer is, this is going to enable you to do compliance as a service. Right? Now that you can automatically test those controls, you can automatically push them out, you can go and say, hey, let me do a pre-audit for you before an external auditor comes in. Let me go take a snapshot. Let me offer this to the business if they're trying to get a feel for, hey, we're wanting to move into a new market that's going to have this compliance standard. Compliance team, can you tell me how far away we are? Right? You can begin to get into those conversations early where you're going to have bigger impact. The other shift that you want to see is instead of having to be a compliance-based program, shifting to a risk-based program, right? And now you're going to start changing the business. Instead of just making sure that we've got our backside covered, we're going to go in and say, hey, let's help drive down risk in the business. Let's do some targeted audits where we know there's more risk. And last of all, this is where you're going to finally get that leverage that you need to be able to tackle emerging technologies. Right? This agility that it's going to enable, you can go and start iterating in your compliance program where you're saying, hey, new technology, I'm going to go ahead and throw this automation at it and see where we score. I'm going to work with the developers as they're playing with this technology to play with my compliance so that my compliance is in tune and releases with operations. Once you've done that, once you're risk-based, once you can offer it as a service, and you can pivot quickly to emerging technologies, you've shifted again into a higher gear in your compliance automation. So let's tackle that last piece. That last piece is that tracking, right? Where you're trying to do what I call a snapshot audit, a point-in-time audit. If you could move away from, I kick off an audit, it runs, and then I close it down, you don't have those costs and those heavy weights now on people, and because of the automation, you can move using Security Hub to continuous automation. And what this really looks like is you're going to be able to dynamically shift left your compliance program. So one of the great examples with Security Hub is if you can enable Security Hub so that when your developers push code out to AWS in their dev environment, in their test environment, AWS Security Hub can report back, hey, that just knocked you out of compliance in your test environment. So now your developer has immediate feedback, oh, that change I made just knocked me out of compliance. I just exposed an S3 bucket publicly, right? So that's what you want to do, is you want to start building, so to speak, that education, that shift left into even your developer's mindset, so they immediately know when they've made a change that's going to push you out of compliance. The other thing is instant audits, right? Imagine if you're in front of the board or you're with your CIO and they say, hey, can you tell me this group is making me really nervous? Are we okay? Are they doing what they need to do? You can go back and take a look and say, yeah, I can report to you we're hitting 70% of the benchmarks. We got about 30% to work on. Looks like that team needs to focus on their IAM. They got a little out of control over there, right? Can you imagine being able to provide that immediate feedback to your superiors about where your compliance program is? The next thing is real-time deployment of new standards. We know that in compliance, we're consistently getting new standards, new expectations, updated standards. What if as soon as those came out, they were populating and you could immediately deploy them? Not only could you immediately deploy them, but you could turn around and measure against them and provide feedback. Hey, that new standard that came out, I can future look in my compliance program and say, we're about 50% out of compliance. It's about half our controls. I'm estimating that I need this amount of money and this amount of time from the business in order to catch us up with this next standard, right? So you want to be able to get ahead of your audit and be able to predict and project in the future. And so your executives don't have those surprises. And that's one of the huge things that you can enable through this continuous audit. When you're able to start predicting the future, when you're able to start deploying standards immediately, that's when we start seeing that automation start hitting the floor, right? We're going full speed now. We're starting to really dynamically impact the business. We're starting to build ourselves as auditors and compliance officers as trusted people in the business, providing our executives feedback. But let's get back to some of the real numbers. In ProServe, we love to build business objectives. In AWS, we love data. How do we get back to the real data to justify what we're doing? Well, fortunately, some of that's already been measured for us. If you're a company that has less than 50 controls, first of all, lucky you, but 25% of them were automated, that means you would have a 52% cost reduction per audit. So that's a pretty drastic impact. If you have greater than 50 controls and you're 25% automated, still a 27% cost reduction. I'm not real good at math, so I did that ahead of time. That means a 1 to 2% cost savings per control you deploy. So I want you to think about that as we're walking through. All this setup is because the technology part of this is easy, right? It's selling it and explaining it to the business that's hard. Every time you see Krista click on one of those controls, you should hear the cha-ching, right? That's a 1 to 2% cost savings per control that I can communicate to my management. So we're going to take this one step further. I know we've already blanked out everything with automation here, but what if you could move to something that was proactive and preventative? And we're going to actually talk about that with Control Tower. And let me tell you what that looks like. That means being a quality differentiator for your business, because you can say, hey, I can guarantee my products won't leave the door with these compliance risks. Imagine what kind of competitive place that would put you in the market. What if you could be the fastest one to market, in part because you've eliminated that costly compliance check at the end of every product release or at the end of every new product? So that's a great place to measure impact, by the way, how long your compliance takes per release versus if you automated and got that to near real time. What does that impact on your business? And last, proactive compliance. Now the developer pushes that out and it says, nope, sorry developer, you can't do that. What that does now is that forces the developer to immediately put in the correct controls for compliance. I don't think there's anybody in the compliance world that hasn't written up a report or gone to the business and said, hey, this is out of compliance. And they say, oh my gosh, if we only knew about that 6 months ago, You know, it's going to cost $200,000 to go back and fix that. That's what we're trying to get in front of, right? Is can we avoid rework, refactor, and waste by getting those compliance in early and being proactive and preventative? When you get your program to being proactive and preventative, that's kind of the 95% goal. You're really getting there, and you're going to set yourself up for success, not only earning the trust of your business, but beginning to show yourself as an enabler. So those business outcomes: reduction in errors, reduction in cost, reduction in time, right? You should be able to quantify those with your business based on those stats I showed you. You're going to be able to increase your scope, offer compliance as a service. You're going to be able to address new compliance regulations, right? We're trying to future-proof for that future state where we know we're going in the cloud. Address new technologies and leverage the cloud to your benefit instead of being another thing you have to figure out. So I'm going to focus again on that 1 to 2% cost savings per control you implement as we start moving towards the next presentation. Before we jump into the controls, I am going to set a little stage here of what the scope is. This is securing your part of the cloud that we're helping you enable. If you're concerned about how AWS secures our part of the cloud, go ahead and check out Artifact. It has those pieces in there for you already. We also are limiting our view to the compliance in the cloud. So if you're doing DevSecOps, you probably do have controls that you need to embed into your DevSecOps. There's a great presentation for that, but we're not going to be focusing on pipelines and DevSecOps. Also, if you want to reference architecture, if you're kind of like, are we doing a best practice audit? Do we have all the different expected tools for our security and compliance teams? We have a great presentation for that. It's a security reference architecture. I encourage you to check that out too. It's really great, but that's also not going to be our focus on architecture. We really are going to focus on how do we deliver, starting with Control Tower, those controls to enable automation in the cloud. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand off to my co-speaker, Krista.
Thanks, Chad. So before we get started about the AWS impact, I'd like to know from you, how are you managing your regulatory compliance in your organization today? Do you have an in-house team? Are you primarily using third-party tools? Are you looking for ideas on how to do this? Or do you primarily rely on your cloud provider to ensure this compliance? Okay, let's go to the results. Okay. Predominantly, you have an in-house team that manages your cloud compliance. So that expertise that Chad was talking about is really where you're focusing your need and your improvement. That's great information. Thanks for sharing. Here's how Control Tower can help. Control Tower is really the best way to set up a multi-account environment. With Control Tower, you can set up a scalable and secure environment that's based on AWS best practices. So we've developed these best practices by talking to thousands of customers and also working with our security teams to define the configurations that will help you create a foundation to be successful. We also have mandatory controls that help keep these blueprints in place. We also have an automated account creation process so that you can provision new accounts within this governance framework so that from day one, they're compliant. And additionally, as Chad mentioned, we have a dashboard that helps monitor compliance for anything that has changed a compliance status, maybe has gone non-compliant, but also gives you a view of your overall organizational structure, right? So you can see all of the OUs in your accounts and other resources that are associated with those. Now, Control Tower is great for setting up a brand new environment, but you can also extend governance into your legacy accounts with Control Tower. So this is a change. When we first launched, it was only for new environments, and over the last 2 years, we've enabled this ability to extend that governance into your existing accounts. So what does this mean? So what is the landing zone specifically? So the landing zone is the enterprise-wide container that holds all of your organizational units, accounts, users, and other resources that you want to be subject to compliance regulation. And what's great is that the landing zone actually scales to fit your business needs. We also set up a centralized identity and access logging. So with AWS Identity Center, you can centrally manage your users along with their security credentials, really simplifying how you manage access to AWS accounts and business applications. And you can control all of your IAM and Identity Center access and permissions across your accounts with Control Tower. I mentioned that we have this account vending machine or account factory. And really, this is a configurable template, right? So that you can either use Control Tower defaults that are set up in the account, or you can actually customize them to be specific to your business needs. We also have a set of partner configurations that are still aligned with best practices that have additional ideas about what you may want in that account template. And then lastly, we'll talk a lot today about the additional controls. So we have the mandatory controls that really protect the configurations of your environment and what Control Tower sets up and manages on your behalf. But we also have a number of optional controls that you can layer in to really enhance your security posture. And what's great about this is that this is something that you manage continuously, right? So you might just set up one landing zone, right, if you're an enterprise customer, but you can also continually scale, right, with your account structure and nested OU structure in order to make sure that as your business grows, you can have your structure follow that as well. So under the hood, Control Tower actually orchestrates 14 different services. Some of these will probably be very familiar to you, AWS organizations, CloudTrail. We also have Config and Security Hub, as well as CloudFormation that help set up controls on your behalf. But really what we're doing with this underlying automation is removing this undifferentiated kind of heavy lifting of setting up your infrastructure and really removing that burden from your teams to the Control Tower managed service product and really helping you accelerate your cloud journey. So just a reminder, if you didn't know, there isn't an additional charge for Control Tower. You only pay for the underlying services that are enabling things like controls. So that when we use config for detective controls, there is an underlying cost for the configuration item recording for those checks. So let's get into the specifics. What happens when you set up a landing zone? First, Control Tower creates 2 organizational units. You have your security OU and your sandbox OU, as you can see here. In your security OU, we set up a log archive account, and we also set up an audit account. In your log archive account, this account works as a repository for logs of API activities and resource configurations from all of the accounts in the landing zone. The audit account is restricted. It's designed to give security and compliance teams read and write access to all of the accounts in your landing zone. It also contains the AWS config aggregator that collects configuration and compliance data from multiple accounts and regions within the organization, which allows you to view and query compliance results within a single account. We also create a native cloud directory with Identity Center and apply all of the mandatory controls. We also use CloudFormation stack sets in order to set up these resources in all of the accounts and all of the regions. What happens when you create a new account factory? So now we're moving over to the sandbox OU. When you create a new account, we have that account baseline. But what that really means is that we've enabled CloudTrail and Config to centralize logging into an S3 bucket that's located in that log archive account. We've also pre-configured Amazon Simple Notification Services, or SNS, right? SNS topics that other services can subscribe to. We've provided federated access via Identity Center, and we've also enabled lifecycle events, which allow you to configure and any additional custom automations as a part of this new account creation. So this means why it's so important really to have this foundational best practice architecture is because you can scale from this, right? We've set up all of the best practice configurations so that you know from day one when you create accounts or when you're trying to really extend governance, you have this ready to go. So we have 3 different control types. The first is detective, and detective resources or detective controls are primarily behind the scenes config rules and security hub checks, right? So you can detect resources that violate your defined security policies. And these can either be compliant or non-compliant. As a best practice, we suggest that you actually run detective controls first within your environment before you implement our next types of controls, such as preventive. So preventive controls really disallow any action that would lead to violations of your policies, right? So these are always compliant. And these are a great tool, and I think that tool is more of a hammer, right? If you always want to make sure that you're compliant and you really are blocking actions, you can do that with service control policies or our preventive controls. Now, our third type of control are proactive controls. Is anyone using proactive controls with Control Tower today? A couple? Just a few? Okay. These are new. We launched proactive controls just at reInvent last year. And so these behind the scenes are CloudFormation guard policies that are implemented by hooks, right? That actually scan resources before they're provisioned, blocking provisioning if the resources aren't compliant. That means that you are always compliant and that you only get to provision approved resources, right? Control Tower has over 400 managed controls in our library. Did anyone see our feature release announcement yesterday, launching 10 new Security Hub controls? Anyone? One? Kind of? Maybe? Okay. It's new, right? We're continuing to add to this library. These are managed, meaning that we do the threat modeling, right? We keep them up to date as AWS launches new features, and as regulatory requirements change or evolve, we'll either modify the control, create a new version, or we'll create a net new control depending on the change, right? So that means that you don't necessarily have to pay attention to that anymore. We'll manage it on your behalf. We cover 39 services, and we've introduced control objectives. And so control objectives are really like a very singular intent, right? And an example of that would be encryption at rest. You can enforce encryption at rest for many different services, but that intent goes across multiple frameworks, right? I've heard from customers where when they're trying to meet a specific framework that they actually are applying the same control multiple times in order to meet each individual framework. By orchestrating or kind of mapping these two control objectives, you only have to apply that control once, and we provide the mappings to those frameworks for you. So it's not just NIST or PCI, it's actually the specific element or specific section of NIST that will define where that control is. So all of those spreadsheets that Chad was mentioning, we'll manage that on your behalf too and show you those mappings. Now, a question for you. So I mentioned we have 39 services that are under our comprehensive controls coverage today. I'd love to know, where would you like us to invest more? Which of these services are you most concerned about providing compliance for? Okay, looks like we're ready. Okay, databases and S3 are tied. That makes sense, actually. We hear that a lot. And I'll actually be showing a couple of examples of our S3 controls today, so you can see what we have available. here's an example of some of our additional controls that we have. We also provide guidance for these controls. I think it's difficult, even if you have 400 controls, to understand or to figure out where should I start, which control objective should I look at, which control should I specifically look at. And by adding guidance, we can help direct you towards that. So for example, some of our strongly recommended controls are enabling the MFA on the root user and disallowing public read access to S3, right? So it's a great place to start. We also hear from customers, okay, that's great, you have controls, you have control objectives, I have the framework or the architecture, how do I actually apply these? And we hear from customers, specifically those in highly regulated industry in the public sector, that they really have some concerns around data residency, right? So today, you can use Control Tower to deploy data residency controls and to prevent provisioning of resources in unwanted AWS regions by restricting access to AWS APIs through service control policies. So we have a landing zone level region deny control that allows you to both dynamically select which regions you want to govern and which regions you'd like to deny. This region deny control also is just a great way to help contain your overall landing zone. So maybe you don't have a specific data residency concern, but you want to make sure that you are optimized from a cost perspective and don't see engineers creating resources in regions you'd really prefer not to be in or don't need to be in. We also have additional controls in this data residency suite that really help support additional controls for underlying services. For example, blocking S3 cross-region policies and blocking the creation of internet gateways. So this way, the content that's hosted on AWS for processing or storage can't be transferred outside of your selected regions at that infrastructure level. So for example, a customer in Germany could deny access to services outside of regions, for example, maybe they're just in Frankfurt, and they can do so with some of these controls with the exception of global services, right? Another area that we hear from customers often is really about how can I help enforce encryption at scale? And so, overall, we provide tools that really help you to easily encrypt your data in transit and at rest to make sure that only authorized users can have access to it. So with Control Tower, we have a landing zone. You can customize your landing zone to include KMS encryption. And we also have two specific encryption control objectives, encryption at rest and encryption at transit, that have a number of controls that help you achieve this, right? So how we pull this all together is, this is an example, right? So if you're trying to enforce encryption at rest for S3, you can see that there are 3 different frameworks that it's mapped to. You can see that we have a type of control, right, for each, or a S3 specific encryption control that's detective, preventative, and proactive. And we also map the relationships between these controls, right? So you can have a holistic view and understand how to employ the most applicable controls to your environment. Okay. Now I'm going to get started and actually share a demo with you about really that last mapping that I shared. So move forward to this. One more click maybe. There we go. Okay, so this is our Control Tower dashboard, and you can see that we have a recommended actions bar, and then also have a summary of your environment, of your OUs, accounts, and of the controls that are enabled. We also have a view of your non-compliant resources. So as we move over into the controls category, you can see the 3 types of mappings that I mentioned. So control objectives, right, which, just a reminder, is a high-level intent that you're trying to achieve that typically requires a group of controls to enable. And we have a number of examples, so encryption at rest, encryption as transit that I mentioned. We also, some of our more popular objectives are limiting network access and optimizing costs. You can also view these by service, right? So maybe you do want to just focus on S3, you can do so and search that here, or you can go by framework, right? So if you want to see all of the controls that are applicable for like NIST, you can do so. You can also adjust your view if you want to see like which framework specifically that these are applied to if you're in one of the other screens, or the severity or the control owner. You can adjust those here. So let's go back to the control objective page and walk through that encryption for S3 example. So if we go to encryption at rest and actually search for S3, you'll see the controls that pop up for this control objective and that service specifically. You can see we have a proactive control, a detective control, and a preventive control. And all of these are related to making sure you have server-side encryption, right? And then disallowing changes. So if you click into the Security Hub-backed specific detective control, you can see we have all of this rich metadata that really helps you understand how this control can be enabled. We have explainers for the behaviors, and we also have within the console and our documentation all of the APIs, right? So you can enable this via the console or by API. You can see the description of the control and also that control relationship that I mentioned, right? So you can see that we would recommend that we also include this inclusive control. We have other types of relationships as well, but this one is inclusive. In order to help you understand that holistic experience. You can view which OUs it's already enabled on, which in this case it's not enabled on any of my OUs, and we'll go forward and actually enable this. So since this is the first control that we're enabling in this specific OU that's powered by Security Hub, it's going to kick off the integration of Control Tower and Security Hub. About 170 of our detective controls are based on the Security Hub foundational best practice. The difference is that ours are enabled individually versus a full standard, and we actually create a Control Tower specific managed standard within Security Hub. Now you can see that control is being enabled. So if we go back down to the relationships and try to enable this proactive control, you can see that this is a CloudFormation guard rule, and again, it's proactive, so we remind you that this scans ahead of time, and we actually are checking to make sure that it's enforced or that it's enforced by CloudFormation, create or update operations. The hook scans for compliance and either allows or passes or fails the implementation. You can see actually within the framework, if you click on those IDs, it goes to the direct section of the framework that's available there. And we've already enabled that Security Hub control, but we also can look and see the specific artifacts that are available for this CloudFormation guard rule. And you can see all of the different scenarios where this could skip, fail, and then eventually pass if you were to apply this. And we really have tried to add in as much documentation as possible, so it's very transparent about what these controls are doing and how to use them successfully. So we have a non-compliant template. You can see that you're missing your encryption properties here. And then you also have a compliant template, which is, has the encryption enabled. But if we scroll down a little bit more, you'll see if we go back to the relationships that there is actually a dependent relationship. So before we can apply that proactive control, we actually need to apply this preventive control. If we were to try to enable that, it would actually be blocked. This preventive control is a service control policy that actually protects that hook mechanism that we're enabling, right? So if we go forward, and you can actually see the artifact again, all of these, whether it's a guard policy or an SCP or a detective control, you can see the artifact within the console or the documentation. So we can enable this control. You can see it's enabling concurrently, right? So you can enable up to 10 controls concurrently today, and we're looking to expand that. And now we're able to actually go back, that we've set up the detective control, which is the best practice to do first. We've set up the required control, which is an SCP, in order to protect the hook, and we can actually go through and enable that proactive control too. So you have this fully kind of comprehensive enablement for trying to encrypt data at rest for S3. Okay. Now I'm going to switch over and actually talk about some of those data residency controls, specifically the region deny control. And so anything with data residency, usually there's some region associated with it. So we're just going to search region in our controls section. Scroll down, and this is, as I mentioned, our most popular control. It is at the landing zone level. And you'll be able to see that we actually, instead of enabling directly on the OU, we'll have to go to landing zone settings to modify this. You can see the SCP, and you can also see that today this is set up so it's showing the regions that I have enabled today, right? So these will be modified as well as the global exceptions to this deny policy. So if we go to landing zone settings, you can see that we are going to be able to view what settings that I have today. I have 4 governed regions, right? The region deny control is not enabled, and I can go through and actually modify settings. And the first one that pops up is this region deny control. You can see an explainer and also a couple of reminders about what a not governed region is versus a governed. So anything essentially that after we enable this control that we select or deselect, so anything that's not with a blue check mark today will be denied after I apply this control. So we'll go through and enable it, and a pop-up reminder to go and remove any configurations or accounts that you have in the regions you're about to deny. We don't want to leave them there. Move into next. And you can see some additional options for configuring your landing zone. So you can choose to use org trails or account trails. You can change your retention settings for S3 bucket logging. You can also enable KMS encryption if you'd like, right? And then next we can review all of the settings that we change and then actually update the landing zone. I'm not going to update the landing zone right now, but essentially that's the process for enabling or changing your landing zone settings as well and enabling that region deny control. So what we've done so far in this demo is we looked through all of our different control objectives. We've actually applied a suite of controls for encryption for S3. We've modified our landing zone settings to enable that region deny control. And we set up that security hub integration so that we now have the control tower specific service managed standard within Security Hub. And I'll show you what that looks like now. So you can see each of the individual detective controls that are powered by Security Hub would be enabled as a part of this standard, and you'll actually be able to see a specific security score so that you have your own custom bespoke standard depending on your business needs. And now I'll hand it back over to Chad to talk about how you can help put this into action.
Thank you, Krista, for that great demo and walkthrough of how we can enable some of those controls. So let's step back from that and come back to some of those business objectives and talk about how are we going to put this in action. So we'll go back to the status quo for a moment and really look at that spreadsheet, right? Right now you should be churning down that spreadsheet. We've got 400 controls with Control Tower that you can immediately take off that spreadsheet and move to automation, at least in your cloud postures. So take those quick wins with Control Tower, check off as many as you can. After that, take a step back and start measuring, right? We're still trying to figure out how we're adding business value here through some of this automation. So look at controls that have high error rate, have high dependency on people in the field, or have a high cost or time to implement and assess. So once you get that, you kind of get that balance of what are the heavy lifts for your program. then you want to prioritize it by how easy it is to implement that control. And so I'm going to walk you through that coming up here on what that looks like as far as levels of complexity, adding more controls to those 400 you've got. So the fast path, right, similar to Control Tower, once you've got Control Tower rolled out and you have those 400 that Krista showed you, or for some reason you don't have Control Tower, you can go straight to AWS config. There's a set of config managed rules. Works very similar. It's a library. You could do it in the console. It's kind of point and click, point and shoot. It is also updated by AWS, so you don't have to do any maintenance or management of that. So those are also beneficial. And now you have the detective, and then you have some of the proactive controls that she talked about that you can fire off directly from this AWS config. So there was 326 last count in this one. So again, you have a chance to really look at how do I start picking off any of those controls that are left in my spreadsheet, especially the ones that are heavy lift or heavy burden. And what's left should be, hey, we've got 5 or 10 controls that are really unique to our company, really significant. We want to drive down. We want to figure out how to automate. There's a number of ways to build your own custom rules. The rule development kit is kind of your best friend. However, I really like this walkthrough, and this is actually from our Control Tower workshop, right, of how you set up an IDE. On that, you build your rules, and you push them out to a Lambda. Lambda will execute and tell you a pass-fail. Once you've validated that, you go ahead and move out and push that using your Control Tower into your managed accounts via CloudFormation. And what will happen is that automation will then run from config. It'll grab that custom rule, pull in the Lambda, do the evaluation, push it back, the results into config, and config will push that into Security Hub. So this is that dev feedback we were talking about earlier. So now right there in the account, that custom rule is evaluated, they see it, but also as we talked about with Control Tower, we'll sync that back up to an audit account so there's a central view that has all the due diligence around it, right? And that way you have the central view as well as the DevOps kind of view. So that is a very powerful way to build. Rule Development Kit is the place you want to start. The Control Tower workshop will take you through this exact flow. So if you're interested in how to kind of do this compliance as code workflow and build your own things that you can execute on Lambda, this is where you want to go. And like I said, as you're weighing those, these are the ones where there's high value, but they're custom to you, and you can't find them in those other two rule sets. This is code, so it is CLI based. It won't be the same menu driven either. So getting to the last piece, the attestation part with Audit Manager. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about AWS Audit Manager. This is your automated audit for when you really need that point in time collection. You can break it out multiple ways. You can see this is actually an audit in process. The red are the failed controls, the green are the passed, and the gray are the not yet assessed. So it's running through the audit actively as we're looking here. The output you can download, you can provide to auditors, you can evaluate yourself and work through it. You can look by control or by evidence. So it's really up to how you conduct your audit. Did want to talk a little bit about the evidence gathering for the audit with Audit Manager. Right, this is the ideal way to gather evidence. You have a point-in-time collection. It's signed. It's encrypted. So you have a protected evidence file that can't be tampered with, that has limited access, and then it sends out that alert and that data to Audit Manager, and will send out any alerts through SNS topics. So you have secured, encrypted evidence, which is another piece we didn't even really talk about. You've again taken another step towards driving errors out of your process. So Audit Manager is a great way to start in getting some of that automated attestation. So where to start? We talked first about Control Tower, right? Get familiar with Control Tower. Control Tower is the fastest, easiest path. It's not the only path, but it is the quickest. So take some time to read about Control Tower, understand what your organizational setup is, and work from there. Next, you want to practice these AWS Control Tower, right? We're shifting the paradigm from the traditional audit thinking where we're just adding one thing a year, to, hey, how do I iterate in my audit program? Part of that is getting comfortable being in the console and working through audit. These workshops give you a controlled environment that you can walk through, that you can learn at your own pace, and you can kind of experiment with these controls yourself. If you're not comfortable doing it yourself, that's okay. We also do immersion days. Ask your account team about this, and they can come in and have you do a guided walkthrough of these workshops. It's the same workshops at this link. You just kind of get a facilitator, and especially if you're trying to ramp up a team, this might be an opportunity. Next, you want to iterate, right? There's a lot of opportunities. Check out our AWS Cloud Governance. We continuously publish blogs and ideas and strategies, as well as updates to these platforms, so that as we advance those products, you immediately see the benefit of those in your environment. Last of all, once you've done this, once you've worked through this process and started to iterate, you'll start to figure out, hey, these things work awesome. I've got a gap here, I've got a gap there, or I'd like to see some of my on-site premise stuff feed into this, or I want to pull something in from other clouds. We've got great partners. So check out our Control Tower partners. Once you've kind of got the feel for what you need, you'll really be able to engage in a strong way with our partners and get the right partner to engage to close any gaps you have. With that, I really want to thank all of you for coming today. I encourage you to go build a compliance DevOps program. I'm going to coin that the Comp DevOps program. And remember, we're really trying to work towards business objectives, that reduction in error, reduction in cost, reduction in time. We want to grow our impact with increased scope and compliance as a service. And last of all, we want to future-proof our compliance so that we can address new regulations, we can address new technologies, and we can actually be cloud opponents saying, hey, it's a lot easier to audit if you would move this to the cloud, right? That's the paradigm we want to be in as auditors. We don't want to be the old guys. We want to be the guys on the front end, right? Saying, hey, I understand the technology. I understand where we're going. We want to move to the cloud because we can do more for you as a business if you move your compliance to the cloud. When you get to that place, you know that you've reached the efficiency you're aiming for. So encourage you guys, you're ready, go do this. Please take some time to fill out the surveys. We take those surveys really seriously here at AWS. We appreciate your feedback and want to encourage you guys to go have a good Reinforce. Mm-hmm.